In this video, we'll take the basic material we have created in the last video and extend it with some interesting effects. The problem with seamless textures is that you easily can see the repetition on the surface of the object. And because of that, I show you a simple trick how to vary this texture a bit. For that, I add a mix RGB node between the image texture and the diffuse shader. For both inputs, color 1 and color 2 of the mix RGB node, I add the image texture, and between the second entrance and the image texture I also add a RGB curves node. With this node I can adjust the brightness of the texture and also the red, green and blue channel of the texture. And now we need another mix mask, similar to the specular map we have created here. That means we have a black and white mask, and this mask defines different areas on the surface. And everywhere we have black color, then the one texture will be displayed, and everywhere we have white color, the other texture will be displayed. For this mask I add a noise texture. Basically this node creates a colored noise. This we convert into black and white using the color ramp node. And also the ramp allows us to adjust this a little bit further. And this color ramp I connect with the FAC value of the mix RGB node. Now I can adjust the color ramp so we have a little bit more contrast between black and white. And then I can adjust the color of the second texture using the RGB curves node. And also I can adjust the scale value of the noise texture, and then you see the scale of the texture get bigger or smaller. With the detail value you can add more details to the mask, and with the distortion value you can distort the image. And with this noise texture I can control how the colored spots on the stone should look like. And in just a second our stone looks a little bit more different. Certainly this is just a very simple example. You also can add more and more mix nodes and mix other textures to your stone texture, so you get a little bit more variation onto your surface. Also you can change the rotation using a mapping node of the different textures, so you also get a little bit more variation onto your surface. And in this way it's also possible to just use one texture and vary it in a lot of different ways and mix it all together, so you have a very individual surface. Okay, we will add some more stuff to our node tree, and at some point this can be a little bit confusing, and because of that I show you a little trick to keep this node tree organized. So now I select all the nodes which are related to the texture, and then I press Ctrl G to group these nodes into one group. And now you are automatically in the group view of this node, and with Tab you can move out. And if you select this group node, with Tab you can move inside the group, just like switching between edit and object mode. And this group you can name, for example, stone text, and you can see in the top this name will also be displayed. So if you just have one node you want to rename, you simply select the node, press N, and in the properties menu you find label, and here you can type in a new name. And this name will also be displayed on the top of the selected node. So this is very useful if you some days later open up your blend file and take a look at your node tree. You will know exactly what node does what. Okay, to make the stone material a little bit more interesting, we add a moss texture which will be displayed on top of the stone. For that I add a mapping node and an image texture node, and for the image texture I choose a moss texture from the Seamless Texture Pack Volume 2. And here we use all the same settings we used for the stone texture. And then we mix the stone texture with the moss texture using a mix RGB node. Yeah, now we need another mix mask, so the mouse knows exactly where to grow on the stone. And for achieving this I add the normal map node, the separate RGB node and the color ramp node. Then I connect the normal map with separate RGB and the B output with the color ramp. B stands for blue. And the color ramp I connect with the FAC value of the mix RGB node. So what exactly are we doing here? The normal map projects different colors from different angles on our surface. And basically from the top it's the blue color, and with the separate RGB node we separate red, green and blue. And so we have access to the different channels of the normal map. And here we use a blue channel B, and this we connect with the color ramp. And with the color ramp we can adjust this mix mask. Yeah, and you can see if I change the color ramp how it affects the surface. Yeah, and if you take a closer look at this mask, this is useful for many things. For example, if you want to create snow or dust particles or sand lying on the object, you can use this for a lot of things. And in this case, we use this for the moss. So if we Control Shift left click on the Mix RGB node, we can see both textures are in the wrong place. So we have to switch the both inputs, and then the moss grows on the top. And in the end, I correctly connect the mix node with the bump map, the diffuse shader, and the color ramp for the specular map. So if the color of the moss not really fits to the stone texture, you simply add another RGB curves node behind the image texture node of the moss texture. And then you simply can adjust the color and the brightness. So, and if I put this material onto other stones with other shapes, you can see every stone has this unique moss texture on the top. And that's because the normal map will be automatically adjusted to the surface of the objects. Yeah, and also for a little bit more organization, I select all the nodes which are related to the moss texture, press Ctrl G and group this to another group. And this I call moss top. Our stone is lying on the ground, and between the stone and the ground it's a little bit moist and the stone is a little bit darker, and maybe there's also growing some moss. That means we'll also add some moss at the bottom of the stone. But here we'll use another technique so that we have a little moss gradient, basically. For this I add a mix RGB node behind the moss texture. Then from the moss group I copy with Ctrl C the mapping and the image texture node and paste it with Ctrl V outside the group. The mapping node I connect with the object output from the texture coordinates node, and behind the image texture I add a RGB curves node so that we can adjust the color of the second moss texture a bit. So, and then I connect this new moss texture with the mix RGB node in the lower entrance, and so we mix this with our stone/moss top texture. So, and now we have to create another mix mask, and for that I add a mapping node, a gradient texture node, and also a color ramp. The color ramp I connect with the effect value of the mix RGB node, the gradient texture with the color ramp, and the mapping node with the gradient texture. And don't forget to connect the object output from the texture coordinate node with the mapping node. If we take a look at the gradient texture, you can see it does not move from bottom to top, instead it moves from right to left. And to change the angle, we simply can adjust the Y value of the mapping node. Here we use -90 degrees. And now you can see it moves from bottom to top. Using the X location value, you can move the gradient up and down. And with the color ramp, you can adjust how smooth the gradient should be. So, and if I enable the texture and adjust the color ramp and the X location value, you can see how the texture changes on the surface. And also I adjust the color using the RGB curves node so that it looks a little bit more dark brown. So, and if I connect everything correct, we can see the final result on our stone. Also, I group all the nodes for the moss bottom. Yeah, but now we have a little problem if we use this material on the other stones. You can see the direction of the moss from the bottom is on every stone a little bit different. And this has something to do with the local axis of the different objects, because the gradient texture will always move in the direction of the local axis of the objects. So, and if I enable local down here in the header and click on the different objects, you can see the local axes are pointing in different directions. So, and to adjust this local axis so that it fits to the global axis, you simply select all the stones, press Ctrl A and select rotation. Then you can see the local axis is identical on all the different stones. So, and if we take a look at the rendered stones, you can see the gradient texture moves in the right direction. If we take a look at this photo here, we can see that all the edges are a little bit scuffed from the different stones. That means the edges of the stones are brighter. And this effect we also want to add to our digital stones. For that, I at first add a mix RGB node behind the moss bottom texture. Connect this correctly with the bump, the diffuse shader, and the specular map color ramp. After that, I add the color ramp and a geometry node. The color ramp we connect with the FAC value of the mix RGB node, and from the geometry node we connect the pointness output with the color ramp. So the pointness feature searches for sharp edges on our object, and with the color ramp, if we move the handles closely together, we can colorize the edges. So if you move it very closely together, you can see how it affects the surface. And to colorize these edges, I simply connect our stone texture with the lower input of the new mix RGB node. And between those two nodes, I also add a RGB curves node. And so we can simply adjust the color or the brightness of these edges. And here we increase the brightness. Yeah, and also the great thing about that is if we put this material on the different stones, you can see every stone has different scuffed edges according to the hard edges of the surface. Yeah, and that's our finished material for the stones. Yeah, we all are lazy people and we love simple workflows. So I show you how to use this stone material for the robot tank. So simply select one part of the robot, then I add the stone material and press on the number button so the material gets copied. Then I give a nice name like rust, for example, so we clearly can identify this material in our library. So here one very important thing. Before you adjust the copied material, you have to copy all the groups you have created in this node tree. That means even if you have different materials using this same group, it's always the same group. That means if you adjust this group in one material, it will be automatically adjusted in the other material. That may be useful in some cases, but here we click on the to button so this group gets copied and we can change this separately. So then I press on the to button and name this rust text. And with tab I switch into the group view and here I choose a rust texture from the Seamless Texture Pack Volume 2. So then let's render this and you can see the result. So the moss from the bottom we don't need, so this I delete. And then I connect the moss top with the mix RGB node from the pointness feature. And also I want to adjust the moss top a bit, because you can see on the top there's a very even surface and you can see the moss is everywhere. And that doesn't really look good. So that means I click on the to button so the moss group gets copied. Then I switch with tab into the moss group. Then I add a mix RGB node behind the color ramp. And also a noise texture and another color ramp. The noise texture and the color ramp I again use for the FAC value of the mix RGB node. And the second color of the mix RGB node I set to black. So basically what we are doing here is we mix another noise texture into our mix mask. That means we add some more black spots on the mix mask, and so we have some spots where no moss is growing. Okay, this looks quite good so far. Now select all the objects of the robot and as last object select the object with the material we just set up. Then press Ctrl L and click on material, and now the material gets copied to all the selected objects from the active object. That means the last selected object. Now if we render this, you can see it's a blue robot, but I want to have a more rusty robot. So I open up the node group with a rust texture, and behind the image texture node I add another RGB curves node. Then I add a little bit more red and remove a little bit blue, and then you can see the blue turns into red. Yeah, and with this simple color adjustment, the robot looks like he's rusted all over the surface. Yeah, and with these little adjustments, you can use the material of the stone for completely different objects in your scene. Certainly you can do further adjustment for the material like the bump map, the specular map, etc. To show you this on another example, I add the stone material to the tree trunk, rename this material, copy the different node groups, add a bark texture, colorize this a bit, and in this case I delete the pointness feature because we don't need this for the tree. And as you can see, also on the different trees, the material works right. This bark texture we also can use for our branches. That means I add the bark texture, then I add another material slot, add the stone material, copy this and change the name to leaves, because this material we will change for the leaves material. In this case, the branch and the leaves are just one object, and to add the leaves material just on the leaves, you simply select the branch in edit mode, pressing L, and then using Ctrl I you can invert the selection, and then you have selected all the different leaves. Then you select the leaves material in the material list and click on Assign. Yeah, for the leaves texture we don't need the pointness, we don't need the moss. Basically we just need one image texture because we use a UV map. Then I connect the image texture correctly with the specular, the diffuse shader and the bump map. Yeah, and because we have a UV map, Cycles automatically knows where to place this texture, so we don't need all these mapping nodes. Also important, we have to switch back from box to flat, because if we have a UV map, we need the flat projection, otherwise we get an ugly result. Then for the image texture, I choose the texture we have created for the plants. And while creating the plants a little bit earlier, we also had created a UV map, and I open up the UV image editor, switch to edit mode, and here you can see the leaves have the white UV map. And on the other hand, that means all our leaves have the right texture in 3D view. Okay, now let's adjust the settings. The color ramp of the specular map I switch, so the bigger areas of the leaf will be glossy. Also, I decrease the roughness from the glossy shader, so we get a little bit less smoother glossiness. Okay, now let's get to the interesting part, because we want to add some translucency to our leaves. That means light from the other side and also shadows which are projected on the object will be also visible from the opposite side. To achieve this, we duplicate the mix shader and place it behind the previous mix shader. In addition, I add the translucent shader. This one we connect with the second shader input. And for example, if I change the color of the translucent shader to red, you can see the red color is shining through at the leaves. But in our case here, we don't want to be the leaves in another color. And because of that, I connect the image texture with a translucent shader. And that the texture is a little bit brighter, we add a RGB curves node and increase the brightness. That means for the translucent shader, the texture will be a little bit brighter. To show it a little bit better, I quickly add a sun lamp, and you can see the sunlight moves through the leaves. And changing the effect value of the mix shader, you can change the strength of the translucency. So this material I also add to all the other branches, and then we can take a look at our final trees. As you can see, all the leaves of the branches have the same color, and with a little trick we can randomize the color so that every branch has a little bit different color. For achieving this, I add a mix RGB node and connect it correctly with a bump map, specular map, etc. And then I also add a RGB curves node between the mix and the image texture node. Then I duplicate the RGB curves connected with the image texture and also with the second input of the mix RGB node. That means using this both RGB curves node, we can colorize the image texture in two different colors. And then for achieving the randomize effect, we add a color ramp and an object info node. From the object info node, we use a random output connected with a color ramp, and the color ramp we connect with the effect value of the mix RGB node, so we create another mix mask. And now we can choose two different colors using the RGB curves node. For example, on the lower one I add a little bit more red. And now on the leaves from the different branches we get randomly mixed colors between those two colors we have chosen using the RGB curve nodes. The object info node picks always a random value from the color ramp between black and white, that means between 0 and 1. And using this as a effect value of the mix RGB node, that means every object has another mix factor. And as you can see, in just a second we can create an autumn forest. Because all the different trees are using the same material, but using these random settings all the leaves are looking a little bit different. But certainly you also can vary the green color just a bit. And the great thing is, the random value you don't just can use in this particular way, you can use it basically everywhere in your node tree to randomize different things. You can randomize the specular map, the bump map, the color of the stones and whatever. And yeah, you can see you can do a lot of stuff with this. The great thing about our scene here is that every single plant and tree uses the same material. And that means we have the control about our material from all the plants in just one node tree. And then, for example, I simply can adjust the color a bit, and so all the different plants of your scene are fitting together. Yeah, and with these tricks we have showed you in this video, you basically can create all the materials you can imagine. What we don't have showed here is, for example, the subsurface scattering node. It's a little bit like the translucent node, but for objects with a little bit more depth, like if you want to create the wax of a candle or other thicker surfaces where the light moves in. And for objects with more volume you can't use a translucent shader. This is only useful for flat surfaces like we have showed here with the leaves. Yeah, and if we take a look at the ground, basically here we just use the same tricks we have showed you before. You can see the grass is just growing on the upper part and the sand you see more in the inner parts. Also using the pointness feature, the edges are a little bit brighter. So as you can see, here I simply use the same things we have used for the other materials. Yeah, and if we take a look at our scene, for the bicycles, for example, we have just used the same material as for the robot. And certainly we just colorize this in a different way. The persons are just using the texture from the scanning process with a simple diffuse and maybe a glossy shader. The concrete wall is using the same shader as the stones, just with a concrete texture. The backpacks are using same material as the persons, just with another texture. And as mentioned before, all the different plants and leaves from the trees are using just one material. So, but keep in mind, everything we've showed you here you can use creatively. That means you don't have to use it exactly like we did it. Just think of all the things we've showed you. For example, with the mix mask stuff you can do a lot of things. Also you can use a lot more different textures for your materials and mix them together. So just be creative and use the tricks we have showed you in this video.